Prisma was one of the first DevTools I ever used. And today I'm interviewing Søren, the co-founder and CEO of Prisma. How was it that Prisma built one of the biggest communities in the whole of DevTools and got tons of developers, including me, to use it? How have they prioritized building the right features, especially when they have such a big community? And why did Prisma launch their own database product? Finally, how has lowering their infrastructure cost helped them to launch a much simpler pricing model? Enjoy. I was actually, for this episode, because I knew I'd used Prisma back in the day, honestly, really early on in my journey. And I was going back and I was figured out the exact course that I did, which was this Andrew Mead course, kind of introduced me to Prisma while I was doing, learning about Node.js and all that sort of good stuff. And I could imagine that was a big driver of adoption, was when you get into, because it was probably had 100,000 students or something, I would imagine.
Yes.
Yeah. Was it something that you kind of intentionally planned, or was that just kind of chance?
I remember Andrew very well, and we worked directly with him, supported him. I'm not sure if he found us, so we found him. I suspect he found us. But this strategy of working with educators, or maybe you would call them influencers today, it was very deliberate. That was our main growth strategy in the early days. So we worked with people like Andrew. We worked with upcoming frameworks. Redwood.js, for example, is bundling Prisma. That's because we worked with them early on. Sold them on this future promise of what Prisma would be and got them convinced to include it by default. And a lot of our early adoption was really based on this. People finding, getting excited about the possibilities of Prisma and then talking about it. We would help that a lot.
Yeah. And how does it translate? Because I think when I was first, this was 6 odd years ago, and I was a massive noob. I did have a programming job, but I was very much not in any way decision maker and stuff like that. And
yes.
How does it translate when, you're kind of working with the kind of education, there's really early people in their career?
It's a long-term strategy, right? What you're asking is, what is the return on investment for this kind of thing? And
yeah.
And there's no doubt it's a long-term strategy. Today we're speaking, and you used Prisma 6 years ago, and that has a value. It's very difficult to quantify that value, but it has real value because there are probably millions, at least hundreds of thousands of people like you who used Prisma a long time ago and have some amount of affinity to our products, to our brand, who understand what we stand for. It has huge value, and that's really how we looked at our investment in, you could call it marketing or community engagement early on. It was, what can we do now that has maximum impact 3, 5, even 10 years in the future?
This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. If you're building a dev tool, at some point, your customers are going to start asking you for enterprise features. WorkOS offers you single sign-on, skim provisioning, and audit logs out the box. WorkOS is trusted by Perplexity and Vercel, as well as WorkBrew, a homebrew management startup that I recently interviewed. I just told Mike that WorkOS is the sponsor, and this is what Mike said.
Yeah, so WorkOS isn't paying me any money for this. I pay WorkOS money for this, but WorkOS is one of the best developer tools I've ever used. It's the documentation and the experience with building with them is so good. I initially was almost okay, this seems expensive, but then I built an integration with them in about 20 minutes that I had spent 2 days bang my head off the wall trying to build it directly with Okta. And then with WorkOS, I then have many SSO providers supported instead of just one. So yeah, for me, WorkOS is one of the nicest developer experiences I've encountered in the last 5 years, probably. And it's not surprising because a bunch of the developer team are ex-GitHub and therefore very good at their job.
Go to workos.com to learn more. Yeah, that makes total sense. And I remember when we got connected on Twitter, I was really excited, I know Prisma. This was one of the things, one of my first tools I ever used. Yeah.
So the other thing we did very early on was we really needed to build some awareness. So we we had this strategy that every month we wanted to do something that landed on the top of Hacker News. And sometimes it would be very directly related to what we were doing. For example, very early on, we were very much involved with the GraphQL community. So we built various one-off projects around GraphQL. And those were wildly popular. Everybody was trying to figure out, what is this GraphQL thing? It's a huge new thing. We want to get involved, but nobody really knows. So by being an entity that consistently put out great stuff around GraphQL, again and again and again, we could land on the top of Hacker News. And that means get a whole bunch of developers who are not going to turn into users or customers, but they look at our thing and they see our name, and the next time, the third time, they're going to recognize and they'll be interested again. And over time, that pays off.
Yeah, and it's a pretty big community. I think you have this huge community, I think. It's a lot of people. And was that primarily driven by kind of this strategy around kind of getting top of Hacker News?
So that was the early days, how we really got things bootstrapped. At those times, we were looking at, we have 500 users this month. The next month, we have 800 or 2,000. Those were really small numbers, right? And anything we could do to really get the growth curve started was worth it. Now the numbers are much, much bigger, and they are much more driven organically. There's very little we can do to meaningfully impact the growth of Prisma.
Interesting.
Apart from making a really great product that people continue to love and use.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. How do you, when you can't do a thing and then see growth, how do you kind of measure if you're improving things in a sense,
It's hard. It's really hard. That's the truth. So we're looking at two things, right? We're looking at our dev connections team. That's the developer advocates and support people. Then we're looking at our product development. And those are two separate things, but they both impact the growth of the Prisma community in separate ways. And both of them are hard to measure. But we look at the work happening in those two departments, and then we try to quantify that. So in developer connections, a huge focus of ours is to show up where people are. We have about 1 million developers who are engaging with the Prisma ORM every month. That's a lot of people, and they are in many different places. So we try to show up wherever they are, engage in what they're talking about, make sure they have a positive experience. If they have a misconception about something with Prisma, we help correct that misconception.
Yeah. Having this really big community, I think it's it obviously is amazing, and there's the kind of plus sides to that almost fairly obvious, but I think there's a lot of challenges there as well, right? When you've got this huge community of lots of people have probably different interests, different things they want to do with Prisma. What kind of challenges do you see in that?
Well, the benefit that a startup has is that it's small and nimble. You can make changes quickly. When you have 1 million developers, hundreds of thousands of large organizations that depend on your software, that stops to be true. If you look at other ORMs that are less used, they can make changes quickly. They can move around. They can break things, and people don't complain too much because not that many people use them or rely on them for large applications that have been in production for a long time, and they maybe don't even have people developing them anymore. They just need it to continue to work. For us, that's very different. We don't want to break things. We want to make sure that all of these people relying on Prisma, they can continue to rely on Prisma and upgrade to new versions without having to spend hours and hours fixing things. So that slows us down. As a company, we want to make changes. We want to make sure we can ride on the new wave. We can go where the market goes. But at the same time, we don't want to upset all of our users, because if we did that, then we would lose the biggest benefit we have, which is this huge community that is using Prisma, that is trusting us.
Yeah, it just from my own experiences of my really small dev tool that I made, and as soon as people start using it, I feel especially with DevTools, it's everything is kind of, any things that go wrong are like quite unacceptable, and I think it's a lot more scary than I think most other, like if you're just making like a cool little like mobile app or something that people use, like a social network
Absolutely.
or something. It's like if
that's a funny app, it goes away, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's like, whereas like this is something so crucial to their entire business. It's like, it's much more challenging, I think.
It's challenging, and developers have this mindset that we could just do it ourselves. So why rely on this thing that might be introducing other challenges and might be breaking? Just do our own thing. It's a common challenge in the open source community in particular, where the developers have this entitlement around open source projects, getting really rude in GitHub issues. And as a company, that's okay. We can deal with that, right? Because we have money, we're employing people, we're professionals. But I know for regular open source projects, that is a huge challenge, and it's also burnout with it.
Yeah, like if you're not kind of essentially getting paid to some extent from either directly or indirectly, it's like kind of hard to take, I guess.
Yes, why deal with all of this stuff when you're not getting paid for it? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So actually I was going to say, so for researching this, I have a friend who's amazing, Joe Roddy, who was working with you guys for a little bit, I think.
Oh yeah.
And so I was getting his help with kind of questions and stuff. And,
that's great.
Yeah. He says hi.
Yeah, we've worked really very closely with Joe. Joe is great.
Yeah, he's a super cool guy. And one of the things that we were talking about was like kind of how to like prioritize issues and stuff, and like prioritize the direction when there are so many directions that you could go, and different people with different use cases and stuff like that. How do you think about prioritization?
Oh, that's very difficult. And it's a thing that we have. We're doing it much better now than we have in the past. The challenge with lots and lots of users is that they all want all kinds of things from you, right? And they will come and tell you. The benefit of being an open source project is that GitHub is a very well understood way to kind of take in those requests and prioritize them. We have more than 3,000 open GitHub issues, and it becomes really challenging to manage. Many of those are feature requests that makes a ton of sense. Obviously, we should introduce this feature, and they've been open for 4 years. And it is very clear that starts to become a frustration with the user base, because every single one of those is like relatively simple. But because there are so many, they just add up to way more developer hours than we can invest. So last month we put out what we call the Prisma ORM manifesto that lays out in great detail how we are going to prioritize bug reports, feature requests going forward. And it's really very simple. There are 2 inputs into what we're choosing to work on. One is strategic prioritization that we make as a company. For example, we might say that it is really important that we become the best ORM to use with AI data, support vector search, and so on. That could be a strategic initiative. But then the majority of the work is directly taken from input from the community. It's literally as simple as going to the GitHub issues, sort by upvotes, and then see from the top which ones make sense to work on in the next sprint. So that's what we're doing now. We've been doing that for about a year before we put out the manifesto, just to make sure that process really works. And it works amazingly well. It's an improvement for us, for engineering teams, because they can clearly see what they should be working on, and they know they're working on something that has high impact. And it's working for the community, for the Prisma user base, because they have a clear way to go and signal what they think we should work on. Just go and create an issue or upload an existing one. And then they can see that we actually go and implement the things that they want, that the community wants. And the new features we put out there are the ones that have the most impact, that most people want. It's so silly, so simple. But we've been doing that for a year, and that has completely changed, I would say, the tone in the general feedback we get Twitter, on social media. There's this feeling that Prisma is now much more responsive, receptive to community requests, and moving faster.
Yeah, even though it's not necessarily changed how many issues you're closing or how much work you're doing, it's just the communication around it that like maybe people even feel like they have agency in that, like, okay, well, if it's a really big deal for you, maybe you find a load of other people in the Prisma community that agree with you.
Get your friends to come and upvote. Absolutely. Yeah. And that works because then we'll work on the thing.
Yeah. That's so good. I love it. I love it. I think everyone should have that. And
it's absolutely true. We are the team is the size of the team is the same. It is just that the features we now work on, they impact many more people. Many more Prisma users experience. Oh, they implemented a feature that I wanted because we are working on the highest impact features.
Yeah, I absolutely love it. I always talk about this like analogy that I heard a while back of like apparently this hotel was having issues with like people complaining about a slow lift, and you know this one, right? Like they put in a mirror.
Heard this one.
They put a mirror, and people stopped complaining. And it's like
because now they had something to do.
Yeah, and it's like sometimes you think the obvious answer is like, oh, okay, close more issues, like hire 10x the number of engineers, but actually it's
install more lifts, make the lift faster. Not what you need. You just need to communicate clearly.
Yeah, that's really cool. And so one of the other things I want to talk about is I know that Prisma now is quite different to Prisma when I was using it 6 years ago, and you've been on kind of this evolution, and I'd love to hear a lot about that.
Before we go there, do you mind just talking through the story of you finding Prisma, adopting Prisma? What was that experience like?
So this was, so I think at the time, I wanted to learn, I knew a little bit of Node.js, but I wanted to get better at it. So I, found this course on Udemy, and I think I was pretty interested in like real-time stuff at the time. And I was trying to make like a chat application just like as a toy. And I remember that I was using Prisma with GraphQL, and I think it was like kind of the intermediary, right? Like the kind of like layer in between.
Yes.
And I was using the real-time stuff to kind of have like, just like, okay, if I can type something in one browser tab and then like it pops up in the other one, I was like, magical. Wow, this is magic, and so that was kind of what I did. And I think I wrote like some like a little article on it for myself, and like that's kind of what I did. And I don't think I ended up using it in my job directly, but it was a really cool kind of learning experience. I think that's how I used it from what I remember 6 years ago. So my memory is pretty flaky at this point.
So what you used back then was either GraphCool or Prisma 1?
I think it was Prisma 1, because when I was doing this research, I don't have memory of GraphCool, and I feel like it was Prisma because I really don't think I used Graph, unless it was like behind the scenes I was using GraphCool and I just didn't really know, but I don't remember seeing like GraphCool.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. So when Prisma started in 2016, we were a backend as a service called GraphCool. We were competing with Firebase, Parse, or something like this. We thought that with GraphQL we could make a backend as a service that would scale with you, that would actually work for building real applications. So that was GraphCool. It was a hosted database and the GraphQL API that directly talked to the database through security rules that you could implement in the UI. And it was wildly popular. We got about 500,000 applications deployed on this thing in the span of a year.
That's unbelievable.
But what we found is that our best users, our best customers, they would use GraphCool to implement a prototype, validate that prototype, and then go and allocate a budget for a real engineering team that could build the real product with real technology. And that was obviously a problem for us. We needed to be part of that real application that would be able to sustain us as a company over time. So we made this big decision to say, Graphcool is obviously an amazing product, but the way it's been put together prevents companies from using it for real things in production. So what is the most important part from Graphcool that we can then rip out and build as a real technical component that large engineering teams could rely on? And that was this database abstraction that became Prisma the ORM as we know it. Prisma 1 was a transition towards that, where you still have to run a server that spoke GraphQL internally, but you didn't really see it. And then Prisma 2 was the first real version of the Prisma ORM as you know it today. The API of the Prisma ORM is hugely inspired by GraphQL and that time of Graphcool. The way you kind of specify the top root and then relations from there is this kind of graph. It looks very much like writing a GraphQL query.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's kind of evolved. You've kind of taken like the kind of most useful parts of each step in the iteration and brought it forward into like something a bit, well, I guess you got smaller and then got bigger sort of thing.
Yes. And now we are slowly building our way back to that original GraphCool vision. The cloud products we have released, they use Prisma the ORM at the core, but then they build some of that those magical capabilities from GraphCool and from Prisma 1 back into a cloud product. So a few years ago, we released Accelerate, which is a global database connection pooler and caching solution. So if you query your database from all over the world, from serverless functions, from edge functions, Accelerate helps you cache that data at the edge so users have a good experience all over the world. And last year, we introduced Pulse, a separate product that reintroduces that real-time capability that you experienced with Prisma 1, where you can write a request and it shows up in the other browser, and you don't have to do any of the stuff in between. Until now, you have only been able to work with these real-time capabilities from the backend. So then you would have to implement your own permission rules and your own WebSocket handling. But this project we've been working on with Joe Rodi is to bring that capability all the way out to the browser. And we're going to have an early access version of this ready in a month or two, something like that. I'm very excited for that, because then we are capability-wise all the way back to where we started 6-7 years ago.
But it's much more like modular, right? Like, is that kind of the key?
It's built to actually work at scale in a way that real engineers, decision makers in large organizations can feel comfortable about deploying in production.
Super cool. And you have like actual databases as well right now, so you can actually like run Postgres with Prisma. So
we resisted that for a long time. We thought people who need to operate things in production, surely they want their database to be with AWS or PlanetScale or some other like a serious database provider. It turned out we were entirely wrong. So we have had our cloud platform, Prisma Data Platform, available for about 4 years. And for a long time, we struggled with very low activation rate, and we could not figure out why. And what we learned over the last, about a year ago, we learned that more than 50% of everybody signing up to our cloud platform, they were not interested in any of the products we have. Many of them hadn't even used Prisma before. They wanted a hosted database, and they knew somehow that Prisma is the database company in the Node ecosystem. So they just went to our website. They didn't read anything. They signed up to the cloud product because you need a hosted database, you have to sign up. And then they clicked around for like 1.5 minutes and just closed the thing down and never came back, because we didn't have a database for them. So now we do. We launched Prisma Postgres in early access late last year. In the beginning of February, it'll be GA. So that means you can now actually use this in production. And we've built it with some very, very cool technology. We can dive into it if you're interested.
Yeah, that's it makes I feel like there's this kind of there's like two sides. There's like the kind of people on Twitter saying like, manage your own database. Like everyone should be able to do all this stuff, and like,
Yeah.
people can do it. But then there's also like the reality is a lot of developers don't want to do all that stuff themselves. They just want like they just want the easy life kind of thing, right?
Yeah, easy life. Don't deal with this stuff. And I think that is going to change even more now that is becoming so much cheaper, so much easier to build applications with modern AI tools. And that's a whole other topic we could talk about later if you want. But we are seeing this change where applications used to be something very serious, very bespoke. You have engineers working on it for months and months, years, to this new thing where you can just get a real useful application built in a couple of hours by chatting to an LLM. But this app needs all the usual infrastructure, right? But when it takes a few hours to build the app, you can't spend days or weeks setting up infrastructure on AWS and VPCs and subnets and all this kind of stuff. It's just, one, it takes too much time, too much friction. And two, it's too expensive. You can't have that. So we've designed the Prisma Postgres service such that you can create an unlimited number of databases. Creating another database is essentially free for us because of the way we have implemented it. And then you only pay for what you use, not for compute hours or gigabytes or memory or anything like that. You pay for the request that is made from the application. So that means if you're somebody who makes 5 applications in a month, maybe for yourself, contract work or something, you can have them all work with Prisma Postgres. You can build out tens or hundreds of these applications. And as long as they see very little use or no use, they don't cost anything. And then when the application starts to become successful, you're on Hacker News, the database just scales up to support you. You don't need to configure anything. You don't need to worry about a delay in scaling up or something. It just works, and you pay per request. So you can calculate the exact cost for you per user. There are no surprises around. Oh, now my database is using so many computer hours. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, that's actually one of the questions I had, is because most database companies kind of do price on like kind of compute, or they tend to have like buckets of like, you can have this much usage for the $50 plan, and like, but you went, I think, very differently to all of those. And as you said, you were doing it by like queries, I guess is the. How did you make that decision? And then also like, what are there any practicalities around making this kind of pricing kind of setup?
So we made the decision based on input from developers. We talked to so many people trying to understand what they thought about the existing pricing model. And I think there are 2 existing models. One is the kind of the dominant model, is what AWS does. It is you reserve an instance of this size, and you pay this amount of money per month. And that's your cost. If you want to change it, you have to go in and reconfigure it so it grows or shrinks. That's one model. Then a new model that is starting to emerge, Neon is a great example of this, is you pay for what you use, which is great, except the dimensions you pay on, they're really confusing. So when you sit down there and you're building your app and you're trying to estimate your future costs, it's quite difficult because how many compute hours do I need? How do I know? Neon will scale up and down, and it will pause, but it's difficult for you to figure out what your monthly bill will be unless you go and try it. So the approach we're taking is, let's figure out a way to build the service such that we can charge by the number of requests. It's still a variable, but as a developer, you have a pretty good idea of how many requests your application makes for a visit to the site. You can estimate how many requests the user will make in a month. So you can go and do some simple math and say, if I have 1,000 users, if I get 10,000 users because I'm on the top of Hacker News, this is what it will cost. It's very predictable. So we knew pretty early on that that's the model we wanted to have. Then it was all about, okay, how do we make that reality? How do we make that feasible? How can we build that and make sure that that we can have positive margins operating the product.
Yeah, this is something that I've thought a lot about for my own project. Is like there's sometimes this friction of like what would make sense to the user and is easy for them to like kind of plan out and map, and then also like what makes sense in terms of your margins, because like if you have this, I guess if you have like a very simple like we're pricing by query, someone could do like an incredibly complex query that actually costs you a lot more than you're pricing for, and then like sometimes we worry like it's like you kind of have simple pricing, but then someone comes along and does something like absolutely mad that like costs you a ton of money, and then it's like this is the constant struggle that I think about with like my stuff. And so how did you kind of, because you've got this lovely simple pricing of like just queries, but then how do you think about like making sure that someone can't just come and
abuse it, basically?
Yeah,
and I think the most extreme example of how you could abuse it is Postgres allows you to install extensions. So you could install a Bitcoin mining extension, and then every single request, every single query mines a bunch of Bitcoin and uses all the compute, and it's really expensive. So that is a real challenge. And there are two ways we are overcoming this. One, by making sure that our own costs are as low as possible. So that means we're not operating on AWS. We're operating on significantly cheaper hardware that we fully own. And the other is having limits in place. So we're saying what is a reasonable request for a normal application to a database? What does that look like? We think it will take less than 10 seconds, things like this. So those limits are in place. You can make a request, yes, but it cannot be a request that lasts an hour. You don't want that in normal applications anyway. But we are imposing that as a limit on you in order to make the billing math work.
Okay, that makes sense. And then I assume that you have like some sort of like absolute edge case, like you could just, an account manager or something could just look at it and be like, yeah, that's fine. Or like, I guess if it's a real legit, like they're not mining Bitcoin, like they have a real reason to do such a long query. Yeah.
So we've mapped it out such that even in the most extreme case, the cost to us will not exceed what the user is paying.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
So let's talk a little bit about the technology and the implementation detail. Most of these database services, they run on the big cloud providers. For good reasons. It makes a lot of sense. Most of their customers run on these cloud providers. Most of our customers will run on these cloud providers. If you are using Vercel and Netlify, for example, your serverless functions run on these cloud providers. So you generally want to have your database be as close to your application as possible. But the downside of being on the cloud providers is that they're extremely expensive. Many years ago, it was kind of reasonable, but as the cost of compute storage has just dropped dramatically, the cloud providers haven't changed. So that means paying for raw compute on AWS is maybe 10 times more expensive than if you go to a top-tier co-location center. You buy your own servers and you set that up. Networking, even more crazy, like 100 times more expensive.
Really?
So those are costs that all add up. And if you build a service on top of AWS, Google, Microsoft, you need to pass those costs on to the user, and you need to be very careful about what you allow them to do. If you allow them to do something that you don't account for in your billing model, you can be in big trouble because the unit economics, the base cost is so high that you can't build in a lot of buffer. Whereas if you operate on your own infrastructure in normal data centers, then you have so much buffer because the base cost is so low that you can be a lot less careful about having to pass on every single cost to your customer.
Yeah, and how much work is it to kind of, to actually do it this way versus just using AWS? Like how much I know, so it's a very vague question, but like, is this significantly harder to do it this way?
So if you're on Twitter, many people say just get a VPS, just pay $5 a month to Hetzner or whatever. And that's essentially what we're doing, except we're doing it at scale. So we are not setting up a lot of small VPSs. We're getting our own servers and operating those. And these are in data centers that are right next to AWS. So there will literally be a fiber connection between our data center and the AWS region. Wow. So that means that the latency, not a big problem. But there is a bunch of work you have to do. Right? There's upfront work. One, you need to pay for those servers. You need to set them up. You need to manage the networking yourself. And as somebody who just wants to deploy an application, that makes no sense. That's why you go and buy a VPS or something like that. But for us, venture-backed company looking to have hundreds of thousands of customers, it's not that big of a deal because it's a cost, but it's a fixed cost that is shared between all of our customers.
And you could just hire someone to manage it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That makes sense. And then also, maybe this is just going off piece, but like you said that, it's like 10x more, 10x cheaper potentially, or 100x cheaper with networking. And if you're using like a Hetzner or something, is that like somewhere in the middle, I guess?
Hetzner is really cheap, but they are somewhere in the middle, yes.
Okay.
And Hetzner is great, but they're not a top tier data center. They're not right next to AWS.
Okay.
So that's the budget option, and we want to do something that is comparable to being in AWS.
Okay, so that's also so you're getting a similar performance, basically the same performance as AWS, but a lower cost. Whereas if you're at Hetzner, it would be like a bit lower cost than AWS, but it also would be less work, but it's also not as good as.
That's the right way to think about it.
Okay, that makes sense. That's very, very interesting. Yeah, I spoke to Railway recently, and they're kind of doing. Yeah.
What are they doing? That's a really fascinating company.
I think they're opening their own data centers across the world. They're saying in like multiple locations. I think they're actually. I think they like rent office space, like rent space and stuff, and do the buy everything.
Yeah, and building up there. That's an exciting world.
Which is that another order of magnitude that you could save? Maybe. I don't know. It's funny. There's all the DevTools are doing this themselves now.
Yeah. So I'm really curious how this market will develop over the next 5-10 years. AWS was a great deal in the early days because you could offload all of your server management, all that kind of stuff. But then they haven't reduced prices according to the market. And the open source world of managing servers yourself has gotten so much better. So the value to cost ratio has just completely flipped. And I'm wondering if they are going to respond to that change over time, or if there's still so much unmet demand from large enterprises that are just doing this lift and shift thing into the cloud, so they can just continue to run with these elevated prices for many more years.
Yeah, it's a very interesting time. I don't know. It's they're making so much money, so I imagine that I don't know.
I would like to keep that going. Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to ask about is the database world. So you're now in the Postgres world, and there are DevTools, there are kind of options, and I wondered like how you think about kind of like differentiation.
So we launched Prisma Postgres not because we made a strategic decision that we need to get into the database hosting business, but because our users, our customers came and told us to do it.
Yeah.
Begged us in some cases. So I think that is our main differentiator. It is this massive community of software developers that buy into the brand value behind Prisma, that loves the open source products and want to have a fully integrated experience. So that's what we are delivering. Then on top of that, we're doing some of these technical innovations that I think will make Prisma Postgres more attractive than other offerings. But really, that's secondary. The primary thing is that Prisma Postgres is fully integrated. Use the Prisma ORM, create a new application. It's going to just work out of the box. Prisma has this init command that helps you set up a project that uses the Prisma ORM. In the future, that will enable you to also just spin up a database in Prisma Postgres. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to manage your credentials or anything. It's just there. And when you think about a future where people build applications in hours over a weekend, that becomes important because you need to do it again and again and again. You don't want to waste time with all of this bespoke setup and infrastructure management for each of them. You don't want your apps to be set up differently, right? Because then all of a sudden you have 10 applications, 50 applications you need to manage. And if they all work differently, it's a mess. You want that standardized. Standardization used to be a thing in enterprises, right? Where you wanted all of the teams to work in the same way. But it's also a thing for individual developers, for small teams that are now increasingly working on many different applications at the same time over time.
Yeah. It's interesting that it's like you're building it it sounds like you're largely building it for your own community that wants this, and everyone has different preferences and everyone has different things, and you're building what they want, your
Yes.
audience. Yeah. Audience, community. Yeah.
And we're not trying to build a general purpose Postgres offering that people building Python servers should use. They could, but we don't really care about that segment. We care about people who use Prisma, who are in the Node TypeScript ecosystem, people who understand what Prisma is and the kind of sensibilities we have around developer experience. Those are the people we care about, and those are the ones we're building a database hosting platform for. And this is a large group of people, right? As I said, we have more than 1 million developers every month using Prisma. Lots of people.
Yeah. And I know you said you specifically didn't necessarily want to build like a database. You kind of almost like dragged into it. But when you look at like the kind of like public DevTools, like publicly traded DevTools, like a lot of them are database companies as a proportion. So that's also like exciting that there is this kind of huge opportunity there. And there's like this track record of like big companies being built at databases that provide databases.
Absolutely. And some of the new database companies, they've been on a similar trajectory as us. Have you met with the Terzo team?
Yeah. Cloudblaze been on.
They're a great team, and they've essentially been speedrunning that same trajectory we've been on for the last 8 years. They started out building a backend as a service, had a database component, figured out that they should really refocus on the database component, and now that's their whole thing. Databases are universally necessary, right? You need a place to store your data.
Amazing. And okay, so 2 final questions. The first one is, what advice do you have for DevTools founders?
So things are different today, right? And I really think 2025 is it's going to be all about building applications with AI, with LLMs. It's just going to be hugely transformative. The one thing we're thinking about is the fact that now developers can build many, many applications. And what does that mean for developer tools? I think the biggest lesson we have learned as a company is the value in really growing the community early on. It's just a massive force that we are now riding. The fact that we invested so much in community management, in getting on Hacker News, in doing SEO content early on, and growing this huge community has been such a help for us.
Amazing. And what DevTools are you excited about right now besides Prisma?
So there's one I'm really excited about. It's a little bit nerdy. It's called Feldera. It's a stream processing engine. I think most people using Prisma are probably not that excited about it, but I'm excited about it because one of the big challenges I had in a previous job was figuring out how to scale our database system such that we could avoid doing joins at read time and instead pre-compute that data. And Feldera is an incremental view maintenance engine, essentially. that is really efficient, written in Rust. And I'm really excited for that. I want to see if there's a way we can integrate that with Prisma and make it a part of our data platform.
Amazing. How do you spell it?
Feldere.
Okay, amazing. Check it out, everyone. If you've got anything that people should check out right now,
go check out Prisma Postgres. By the time I don't know, how long does it take for you to get these episodes live?
It's probably going to be about a month, I'd say.
About a month. So by the time you hear this, Prisma Postgres will be in GA. It will no longer lose your data. It'll have backups and everything. Go try it out. There's a generous free tier. Spin up a bunch of databases. I think that's my ask.
Amazing. Søren, thank you so much. This was awesome, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks, Jack. This was great.